GitHub Copilot for code reviews and explaining a code base with Visual Studio 2026. I have this old code base that I wrote back in 2014 as a hobby project, mostly during the weekends. And now at this point, I don't really remember every legal detail about this utility, and GitHub Copilot should be able to assist. Can the AI do this, and in very useful detail? It shouldn't be a problem for any model to make up quick explanations just by glancing through the methods. But I want Copilot using Claude Sonnet 4.5 to explain in as much detail as possible. Now the second part of this exercise is going to be for the AI to give a detailed code review. You can also watch my other videos where Copilot failed to convert or migrate a legacy .NET framework application to the more modern Blazor. Please note the failure was only at the time of recording, and AI is bound to improve very quickly over time. I'm running this test on a free trial subscription of GitHub Copilot Pro, and some premium requests will be used. At the start, I've already used up about 26 requests, and I might want to check in towards the end how much I've actually used in total. So let's see Copilot trying to explain this code. It's generating the explanation, and I ended up having to use DeepSeek to create a well-formatted readable version of the review in HTML. What I would have really loved is just a quick copy button on the actual Visual Studio IDE, so I can just copy and paste into Word. And now the review says, Lotron 2000 is a lottery simulation built on .NET Framework 4.8 with C# 7.3. It simulates winning probabilities, test playing, and historical patterns. The system depends on the external Alexis.jading library for infrastructure concerns, logging, repository pattern, and constants. Okay, that's fair enough. That's what this utility is actually doing. Now it lists all the project without really going into that much detail, and I really love the fact that it explains the core domain logic in detail and left out all the other sort of helper logic, such as repositories. It explains that there is a simulator driver, and it goes into the workflow as to how does the playing session, for instance, from generating a ticket, having the winning numbers, at the end of the playing session, trying to record the stats into a database. Fairly intuitive, self-explanatory, nothing complicated, but it still took the time to explain every little step in a little bit of detail. Then all the way down the line, it tries to get into a little bit of a code review, but at this stage, I've only asked for just a high-level explanation of the code. And it has, as the second most important critical issue, there are static classes that I'm using static classes everywhere. What I would rate as a key flaw of this design, it has it down the list. As the second most important thing, it's got a typing mistake. I don't think the ordering of these issues is in any logical human order. It just sort of went through them as it saw them, as it was computing them. Now, to the conclusion, it's just more or less the same issues, but it's just summarized them. So there's really nothing new here. Okay, so this is, I would say this is a decent review from Claude Sonnet, which is the model that I selected. So how would I then rate this review? Well, let me just first give my own review that I would have generated outside of, let's say, this AI. So, I mean, keeping in mind that I wrote this code back in 2013, 2014. Yes, Copilot got the super obvious stuff correct. This code is some sort of lottery simulator with the hopes of one day, hoping that one day in a trillion years, not a million, not a decade, not 100, but a trillion, I would hit the jackpot. And I'm not sure if our solar system would still be around by then. But hey, just take a chance. And the lottery is almost always a losing game. So my own review, when I wrote this code, I was at a different level of experience. And the only thing that I seem to have gotten right is to have some sort of separation of concerns. So also the good thing is that the methods and variables are very clear and they're explicitly named, which is how this AI was able to sort of figure out very quickly and explain, because I mean there's no hidden There's no confusion, there's no shortened variables. Everything is readable, the intent is actually quite clear. And now the first obvious issue, as AI has already pointed out, is that almost everything is a static class. I'm not quite sure why I did this, but just to show that I was at a different level of knowledge and experience back then. The other obvious issue is that the logging is done incorrectly. There's too much use of the try-catch block, but then there's no specific exceptions being handled. And also now, maybe further down the list in terms of critical issues, this is not a big one, but there are a lot of regions throughout the code, and this is generally a bad smell. Too many regions could be an indication of the code being too large and needs to be refactored into more focused methods or classes. Then now coming to the actual crunch, or the big issue now, this code is not following any common best practice architecture or structure. I am trying my best. There's an attempt at using repositories. This is being placed in a separate project from the business logic class, but it's very, very obvious at this point. I have very little understanding of topics such as domain-driven design or clean architecture. So I have all these classes that are marked as business logic, but they're actually only proxies for repositories. In other words, they don't really contain any actual business logic, but instead only take entities and perform CRUD operations. The correct terminology for this anti-pattern is anemic domain models. So you have something that's meant to be in the domain, that's meant to have a whole lot of business logic, but it's only just doing CRUD. At this stage of my experience back in 2013, it looks like I would have read about domain-driven design, or maybe have just watched a few videos, but didn't really yet have a full understanding of practically applying those ideas. Domain logic should be in the actual entities themselves or in domain services. A domain or business logic project should not know about persistence details or the database. So if we look under references, this business logic project has a reference to the data project, meaning the data project is technically the core of the solution, which is just plain wrong. A solution that follows a common best practice would have the domain project being the real core, which does not depend on any other infrastructure such as repositories. The result of this bad architecture is that it will be harder to have pure unit tests. Right? Pure unit test, I mean, you can just create any test and call it a unit test, but it's not necessarily technically a unit test if you are then having to call a repository or make calls to a database. For example, if I wanted to test the winning number permutations, this depends on injecting a repository and implying that we're going to need to call a database. And this is no longer a unit, but is now an integration test. Another architectural issue, the generic repository lives in a separate external DLL. Also, the key functionality of generating random numbers also lives in a separate external DLL. So these two components are not immediately testable within the solution. The generation of random numbers should instead be in the domain project. I mean, it's a key building block of this entire system. Now, I just want to compare the reviews. I've just gone into very, very long detail about my own review of this code, and I want to compare this with the original review that Claude Sonnet created. And I'm giving my own review to Copilot, and let's see what it says. And there are some critical parts the review did not really highlight. These are mostly around architecture. Yes, my 2014 code tries very hard to have separate projects, but there's no recognizable modern architecture. That's a big problem. And in this report here, there is an updated severity of these points that AI has missed. And here's what this revised report does say. As the final verdict, it's giving me an A+. I'm thankful for that. It says you've identified the most critical architectural flaws that are missed. You correctly diagnosed the anemic domain model anti-pattern. You spotted the dependency inversion problem. You understand clean architecture principles that weren't applied. My review B, which is the original review from Copilot, I covered implementation details well, static classes, error handling. I missed the big picture, architectural problems. I should have analyzed the project references and dependency direction. I focused too much on code level issues and not enough on architectural level flaws. It's very generous of Copilot to give me an A+, and at the same time giving itself a B. It makes me feel good. At this point, I want to get a third opinion from another AI model, which would be ChatGPT. I'm going to use the web-based chat version. So I asked ChatGPT to evaluate and score the review generated by Claude Sonnet 4.5. ChatGPT comes back with a review for Copilot as 6.5 out of 10. The review only indicates issues on a code level and not on a bigger picture architectural scope. What about my own verdict at this stage? I would say the original code review from Copilot using Claude Sonnet 4.5 would be a 5 out of 10. But it could also be, it's also that my initial instructions and prompt should have been a little bit more detailed. If I had told it to also look at the architecture, it would have actually done a more thorough job. It would have gone into a little bit more detail. So, if my software development skills was still at the same level of 2013, the original review from Copilot would not have pointed out some critical areas. Effectively, if I relied on this original review as my mentor, I would have missed the bigger picture